There was a time when Adrian Cole's footsteps ruled the marble floors of his empire. Every boardroom held its breath when he entered. Every headline called him the man who outran fate. But fate always catches up, especially with men who never stop running. It had been 18 months since the crash. 18 months since headlights became silence and speed turned to stillness. Now Adrian Cole, 37, sat in a penthouse built for power, but filled with ghosts. Below him, the world moved like clockwork, cars streaming through wet streets, people chasing dreams, while he watched from behind glass, hands resting on the wheels of a chair that had become both his prison and his penance. He moved only when necessary, from desk to window, from window to bed. Even his morning coffee was measured in silence. Once a man of motion, he now lived by ritual. Emails, therapy, medication, repeat. His face, still sharp beneath trimmed dark hair and weary eyes, carried the residue of ambition, but without direction, ambition is only noise. And Adrian Cole had finally run out of noise. On a gray Monday morning, a new name appeared on his assistant's schedule: Lena Alvarez, translator. Adrian barely looked up when she entered his office. Just another consultant hired to decode investors and their words. But then she spoke. It wasn't the greeting that struck him. It was the tone. Warm. Careful, like sunlight trying to break through storm clouds. She was 28, graceful in movement, confident in stillness. Dark hair tied in a loose knot, a pale scarf around her neck, and eyes that seemed to translate more than languages. They translated pain. For the first time in months, Adrian blinked slower than usual, long enough to remember what human warmth looked like. She began reading his documents in flawless Italian, then in French, each word smooth as glass. Yet somewhere between Bonjour, Monsieur Cole, and Grazie per la fiducia, he stopped hearing meaning and started hearing the spaces between, the pauses, the tiny breaths before certain phrases, as if every language carried a secret ache. She noticed the framed newspaper clipping on his desk, the article about his accident. Most people looked away politely. She didn't. Her gaze lingered, eyes soft but searching, and then she smiled. A small, almost apologetic smile. The kind that said, "I see your pain, and I won't pretend I don't." Adrian didn't smile back. He couldn't. But something in him, something long buried, shifted. He found himself speaking more than necessary, asking questions he hadn't asked in months. Not about business, about her, where she learned her languages, why she chose to work with people who barely spoke at all. She answered simply, because silence can be louder than words. Those words stayed with him long after she left. That night, when city lights bled through the rain and shimmered across the glass walls, Adrian realized he had memorized the rhythm of her voice. He tried to work, failed. Tried to sleep, failed again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her smile, soft, patient, untouchable. He didn't know why it unsettled him so much. Maybe because it reminded him that even the broken could still feel, or maybe because he knew, deep down, that her smile carried a secret of its own. He noticed it, a faint scar on her left wrist, thin, old, half hidden beneath a silver bracelet. Something about it sparked a memory he couldn't place, a flash of headlights, a hand reaching through smoke. But the memory slipped away, like rain down glass. Morning sunlight crept through the tall glass windows of Adrian Cole's penthouse, spilling gold across steel and silence. For months, mornings had been mechanical: coffee, emails, silence. But this one felt different. Somewhere between the rain and the quiet, a stranger's smile had left a trace of warmth behind. He rolled to his desk, opened his laptop, and found a new message. Translation notes. Lena A. Detailed, precise. Oddly personal. At the bottom, a single line stood apart. If you ever need the sound of another language again, call me. He read it twice, then again. Simple words, yet they carried something he hadn't felt in a long time. Permission to speak again. Lena returned that afternoon. Her voice filled the quiet corners like sunlight in an empty church. She read reports, translated investor updates, and smiled occasionally when she caught him watching. Adrian, usually sharp, impatient, let her rhythm set the pace. He caught himself listening not to meaning, but to melody. She spoke 7 languages, yet the one she taught him wasn't written in any book. It was patience. It was kindness. It was the courage to look at someone broken and not look away. During one meeting, a stylus slipped from his hand and rolled beneath the chair. Before he could reach for it, Lena was already there, kneeling, retrieving it quietly. Their eyes met in the glass reflection. For a second, time slowed. No words, only a silence heavy with something unspoken. She placed the pen back in his hand. Her fingers brushed his. The touch was brief but electric, like the first warmth after a long winter. "Thank you," he said, his first genuine words in weeks. Lena smiled, but the smile trembled, as if she wasn't used to hearing gratitude from the man she secretly feared. Days settled into pattern. Translation sessions, quiet lunches, occasional laughter. He learned she always carried a small leather notebook filled with foreign proverbs. When he asked why, she said softly, "Because when words fail, proverbs remember." He didn't understand then, but he would. She translated for calls with France, Japan, Argentina. Every time she spoke for him, her tone carried pieces of him he'd forgotten. Empathy, humor, grace. Even Victor, his business partner, noticed. "She's good for you," he teased. Adrian ignored him, but knew it was true. One night, long after everyone left, Adrian replayed meeting recordings. He listened not to himself, but to her. Between translations, her breath sometimes trembled, like someone hiding emotion. Then, in one recording, when a delegate mentioned the crash, her breath caught sharply, almost a sob, quickly swallowed. He paused, rewound, listened again. Brief, but undeniable. Unease returned, the same chill he'd felt when he saw the scar on her wrist. Headlights, smoke, a woman's voice screaming his name. The sound vanished before it formed. He shut the laptop, wheeled to the window, watched the city flicker below. For the first time, he wondered if love could begin where trust still feared to go. A week later, Lena found him alone in the rooftop conservatory, a glass garden he rarely visited. He used to love plants. Now most had withered in neglect. Lena quietly began trimming dead leaves, humming in Spanish. He watched in silence until curiosity won. "What are you humming?" "It's a lullaby my mother sang when I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of silence," she said. "It can be louder than screams." Something in those words cracked the walls around his heart. He didn't reply, just handed her a watering can. They worked side by side, one hand strong, one trembling, until sunlight pooled like forgiveness across the glass floor. That was the first time in months Adrian laughed. Not the forced chuckle of boardrooms, but a real one, soft, unguarded, surprised. Lena froze, then joined in. For a moment, the wheelchair, the past, the pain, none of it existed. Later that evening, a folder slipped from his desk. Papers scattered across the floor, a photograph sliding free, a newspaper clipping from the night of the crash. Flames, broken glass, a blurred crowd. He froze. In the far corner stood a woman holding her wrist, looking toward the wreck. He zoomed in. The resemblance was undeniable. Lena. Same posture, same hair, same scar. He stared, heartbeat thudding. Why was she there? How did she hide it? And what did she want from him? He shut the laptop, but the silence grew heavier. The woman who'd helped him find peace might also be the ghost who'd taken it away. He didn't sleep. He replayed every smile, every word, every touch. searching for lies. And the more he searched, the more he realized he didn't want to find any. Because if she was part of his pain, then the only good thing left in his life was built on a lie. The next morning, Adrian arrived before sunrise. When Lena walked in, surprised to see him, he simply gestured toward the balcony. "Let's have coffee outside." The air was crisp, the city still waking. They sat in silence, steam rising from porcelain cups. Lena looked uneasy, sensing a change. "Is something wrong?" Adrian studied her, the honesty in her eyes, the gentle curve of her smile. Everything about her said truth, yet the photograph whispered lie. He wanted to ask, but the words felt too heavy. So he asked something else instead. "Do you believe people can heal each other?" She fought for a moment. "I think sometimes we don't heal each other. We just remind each other where it hurts." He nodded slowly, because that was exactly what she had done. Reminded him where it hurt, and shown him it was okay to feel again. Before leaving, she placed her notebook on the table. "Here," she said, "I wrote something for you. Inside, in neat handwriting, in every language, forgiveness sounds the same." He didn't know what she meant, or why forgiveness was suddenly part of the conversation. But he felt the world tilt again, just slightly, towards something inevitable. That night, the office was dark except for the glow from Adrian's desk. Lena passed by, hesitated, then knocked softly. He turned, eyes tired but gentle. "You're still here," he said. "So are you," she replied. She handed him a small flash drive. "Tomorrow's presentation, fully translated." He thanked her, voice low, gaze lingering longer than usual. There was a pause, long enough for two people to say everything without words. Then she whispered, "Good night, Mr. Cole," and left. He watched her reflection fade in the glass, and somewhere deep inside, something fragile began to bloom again. He didn't know whether it was love or illusion, but it was alive. He looked down at her notebook, tracing the words, "Forgiveness sounds the same." Tucked between the pages lay a folded newspaper clipping, half burned, the same article about his crash, with a handwritten note beneath. "I was there, I'm sorry." The world tilted again, but this time it didn't stop at fear. It fell straight into heartbreak. Some truths arrive quietly, others crash through the door you swore you'd never open again. For Adrian Cole, it came as both. He spent the morning pretending nothing had changed, meetings, reports, polite nods. But beneath every word, a question pulsed like a heartbeat. Why was she there? When Lena entered the office, calm as always, he could barely meet her eyes. The photograph lay hidden inside his desk drawer, close enough to burn through wood and conscience. She smiled, oblivious. "Good morning, Mr. Cole." He wanted to say it back, he always did, but today the words refused to come. Instead, he simply said, "Close the door." Lena froze mid-step. Something in his voice, sharp, cold, unfamiliar, told her this wasn't about work. Adrian gestured to the table. "There's something I need you to explain." He slid the photograph across the polished glass. Her breath caught before her eyes even focused. Color drained from her face. She reached for the photo, then stopped halfway, fingers trembling. "It's you," he said quietly, "at the crash site." For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't speak. Only the hum of the city far below filled the silence. Then, softly, yes, it was the smallest word in any language, but it carried the weight of two ruined lives. "Why?" he asked. Her lips parted, closed, then finally. "Because I was there when it happened, and I couldn't leave." He leaned forward, voice shaking. "You were there? My driver died. My company nearly collapsed. And you, what were you doing there?" Tears gathered in her eyes, unfallen. "I was translating that night for the man in the other car." Silence. A silence so deep it swallowed the sound of breathing. In that moment, Adrian's world fractured again, clean, cold, merciless. She continued, voice trembling. He was my brother, Miguel Alvarez. He was driving home after a job interview. He didn't see your car coming through the intersection. Adrian's hands tightened on the chair's armrests. Your brother was the reason I can't walk. Yes, she whispered. But you should also know he tried to save you. That night replayed in her memory like a wound that never closed. Flashing lights, twisted metal, smoke curling upward into the rain. Her voice trembled as the memory took shape. He was alive only a few minutes after the crash. He pulled open your door, freed your seatbelt. He was calling for help when the fuel line caught fire. She stopped, clutching her arms. I was across the street. I ran when I saw him fall. Adrian closed his eyes. Her words collided with the nightmares he'd buried under medication and silence. When I learned later you survived, she said, I wanted to write, to tell you what really happened, but I was afraid you'd hate me. So I did the only thing I knew. She lowered her head, tears streaking her cheeks. I applied for the translator job under my mother's surname. I just wanted to help you rebuild what my family destroyed. For a long time, Adrian said nothing. Rain tapped against the glass like a metronome, marking grief. His voice was quiet, but beneath it lay the fury of a man who'd lost too much to find mercy easily. So all this, your kindness, your patience, it was guilt? Lena shook her head desperately. No, it began as guilt, but it didn't stay that way. She stepped closer, tears falling freely now. I started caring, Adrian, long before I realized how much. He turned his chair toward the window. Outside, lightning split the skyline. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to, but the mind that built empires refused to trust the heart that destroyed one. Get out, he whispered. Lena froze. Please, just listen. I said get out. Her breath hitched, a sound between a sob and surrender. She picked up her notebook, clutching it like a lifeline. If I walk out that door, you'll never know everything, she said quietly. Maybe that's the only way I'll ever find peace, he replied. The door clicked shut, and silence returned to the penthouse. Heavier than before, crueler than truth itself, morning came with colorless light. Victor found Adrian still at his desk, eyes red, photograph beside him. She's gone, Victor said softly. Left this for you. He placed an envelope on the table. Adrian hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a letter in Lena's careful handwriting. Not an apology, a confession, and a promise. Adrian, I never came into your life to deceive you. I came because I couldn't live knowing I'd done nothing. I thought if I helped you find your voice again, maybe I could quiet the one in my head that keeps replaying that night. I never meant to fall in love with you, but somewhere between your silence and my guilt, I found something pure, something worth the pain. If you never forgive me, I understand, but please know this. The man who saved your life was my brother, not the one who took it. You carry his last act of love every time you breathe. When he finished reading, the paper trembled in his hands, not from anger, but from grief. He looked at his motionless legs, the scars on his hands, and whispered, "He saved me." Music built slowly, cello and piano rising like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. For 3 days, Adrian didn't speak, didn't work, didn't sleep. On the 4th day, Dr. Chase visited. She found him by the window, letter open beside him. You finally know the truth, she said gently. He nodded. And does it help? He looked away. It changes everything, but not the way I thought it would. He realized the real prison wasn't his wheelchair. It was the blame he'd built around it, and Lena had broken it, not with lies, but with love he wasn't ready to face. When she entered his life, he learned to speak again. Now that she was gone, he had to learn to feel again. Days turned to weeks. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the marble floor, Adrian wheeled to the balcony. He held the letter one last time, then folded it carefully into his jacket pocket. He picked up his phone and opened his email drafts. At the top sat an unsent message. To Lena Alvarez, subject, I understand. He hesitated, then hit send. Sometimes forgiveness isn't loud. It doesn't arrive in apologies or explanations. Sometimes it's just the quiet act of letting go. As the message vanished into the digital sky, Adrian whispered to no one, "Thank you for saving me, both of you." He didn't know where she was, but somewhere he hoped she'd feel it, that fragile pulse of forgiveness traveling through the air like the echo of a life rebuilt. Months had passed since that morning when Adrian sent the email. No reply ever came. But sometimes silence is its own kind of answer, neither rejection nor acceptance, just peace. He stopped expecting her to return, stopped checking his inbox every hour, and in the quiet she left behind, something began to grow, the faint outline of a man rebuilding himself from the inside out. Dr. Chase's office always smelled faintly of eucalyptus and old paper. It was the only room where Adrian could breathe without feeling observed. He sat facing the window, sunlight soft across his hands. I read the letter again, he said quietly. Dr. Chase smiled. And what did you feel this time? He fought for a long moment. Not anger, just sorrow. But not the kind that drowns you, the kind that teaches you to swim. She nodded. That's grief turning into wisdom. For months, she'd urged him to find meaning beyond his loss. Now, finally, he understood. Healing wasn't a finish line, it was a direction. Sometimes it began the moment you stopped running from pain long enough to hear what it had to say. 2 months later, an envelope arrived, unmarked, thin, the kind you almost mistake for junk mail. Inside was a letter on foreign stationery. The handwriting was unmistakable. If this reaches you, please know I never expected forgiveness. I'm in Madrid now, working as a translator for a rehabilitation center. I teach veterans to find their voices again, the way you once learned to use yours. I think of you when I hear them laugh, or when they fall silent before speaking. You taught me that silence isn't failure, it's part of healing. He read the letter 3 times. Her words no longer carried guilt. They carried light, fragile, but real. She had found her purpose. And strangely, knowing that made him feel lighter too. He placed the letter beside her old notebook, the one that once said, "Forgiveness sounds the same in every language." Now he finally believed it. Spring arrived in the city, warm, unpredictable, alive. Adrian began attending meetings again, not as the man who once built empires, but as someone learning to build people. When the Global Accessibility Summit invited him to speak about post-trauma entrepreneurship, he hesitated, then agreed. He wanted to tell the world that the body can fail without the spirit breaking. The hall shimmered with light as he rolled onto the stage. Microphones clicked, cameras flashed, none of which he noticed. He paused, took a breath, and began. 2 years ago, I lost my ability to walk. For months, I thought that meant I'd lost my purpose. But purpose doesn't live in our limbs. It lives in what we choose to do when we can't run anymore. He looked down at his hands, steady, strong. Pain is a translator, he said softly. It teaches us what words never could. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman listened. Dark hair tied loosely, translator's headset resting on her lap. Her heart pounded like it remembered the rhythm of his voice. When the talk ended, people surrounded Adrian, shaking hands, thanking him, saying his story moved them. But he barely heard them, because across the room, near the exit, he saw her. Lena. Time slowed the way it does when memory and reality collide. Her hair was shorter, her face thinner, but the eyes, exactly as he remembered. Soft, kind, alive. She hesitated before walking closer, clutching a folder to her chest like a shield. I didn't know you'd be speaking, she said softly. I didn't know you'd be here, he replied. The crowd dissolved, sound thinning to silence. Two people standing in the echo of everything they'd broken, and somehow everything they'd rebuilt. She smiled nervously. You were incredible. He looked at her, voice barely above a whisper. So were you back then, even when I didn't see it. They stood in silence, not needing to explain what time had already healed. Some apologies don't need words. Some forgiveness arrives simply by staying. Later, they walked. Or rather, he rolled beside her, through the park outside the convention center. It was quiet except for the hum of wind through the trees. Adrian glanced at her hands. The scar on her wrist was still there, but she no longer hid it. And he realized he no longer saw it as guilt. He saw it as proof that survival leaves its mark. They sat on a wooden bench overlooking the lake. For a while, neither spoke. Then Lena said softly, "You sent that email." He nodded. "I didn't expect an answer. I didn't know what to say. You just did." In that moment, everything unsaid between them filled the air. Forgiveness, grief, gratitude. The past didn't vanish, it simply stopped hurting. Adrian looked up at the setting sun. "For the first time," he said quietly, "I don't want to run from what happened." Lena turned to him, tears shining. "And I don't want to hide from who I am anymore." Their eyes met, and the silence between them became something sacred. Later that night, they sat in the hotel courtyard, city lights glimmering like faraway stars. Adrian leaned back, voice calm. "You once said silence could be louder than screams. I think I finally understand." She smiled gently. "And what does it say now?" He thought for a moment. "It says stay." Lena's hand rested on his, not as apology, not as pity, but as an answer. They didn't promise forever. They didn't need to. They simply promised to begin again, right where forgiveness had left them. Sometimes love doesn't return to complete you. It comes back to show you who you've become without it, and who you can still be with grace. Weeks later, the world moved on, as it always does. But inside Adrian's world, something had changed. He began funding rehabilitation programs, the same kind Lena now translated for. They worked side by side, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, always in truth. Each morning started with coffee and quiet smiles, a new language they'd both learned to speak. He never regained full use of his legs, but he learned something more important: how to stand in his own heart again. Because healing isn't about walking. It's about choosing to move, even when the world says you can't. Maybe love isn't what saves us. Maybe it's what teaches us how to save ourselves. One night, rain came back to the city, gentle, familiar, forgiving. Adrian wheeled toward the same window where months ago he'd first met her. Lena stood beside him now, watching droplets trace silver lines down the glass. "Déjà vu," she whispered. He smiled. "No, this time it's peace." In the end, they didn't need to rewrite the past. They only had to understand its language. Together, they translated pain into something far greater: the quiet miracle of being seen, forgiven, and loved anyway. The city woke differently that morning. The rain had finally stopped. The streets shimmered with light, and the air carried that rare scent, the one that only comes after forgiveness. Months had passed since that day in the park. Winter had quietly turned to spring, and in the spaces between seasons, Adrian and Lena had built something that didn't need a name. They worked together now in a small rehabilitation center funded by his foundation and guided by her languages. The walls were lined with photographs, people learning to walk again, to speak again, to hope again. And in the center of it all stood Adrian Cole, a man who had once lost everything but found himself in the act of giving back. His mornings no longer began with emails and deadlines. They began with voices, dozens of them, from different tongues and backgrounds, relearning the simple music of life. Adrian rolled down the hall as a young veteran practiced his first words in months. Lena stood near the window, translating his halting phrases with infinite patience. "Say it slowly," she encouraged, smiling. "Breathe between the syllables." The man nodded, and somewhere in his struggle, Adrian saw himself, the version that once couldn't speak without pain. He waited until the session ended, then handed Lena a cup of coffee. She laughed softly. "You still remember how I take it," he smiled. "Some languages don't need translation." Their conversation was light, but beneath it ran something steady, a trust earned, not given. That afternoon, the center hosted its first graduation for patients who had completed therapy. The auditorium was modest, wooden stage, folding chairs, paper flowers made by children, but it felt like a cathedral. When Adrian was asked to speak, he hesitated. Public speaking had once been his superpower, but today he wanted his words to belong to everyone. He rolled onto the stage, the microphone low enough for his height. The crowd fell silent. "I used to believe that success was measured by how far you could go without falling. But I've learned something simpler and harder. Sometimes, life is about how you learn to stand after you already have." His voice didn't shake. It carried the weight of truth, not performance. He looked toward Lena in the front row. She was smiling through tears. For the first time since the accident, he felt complete. Not because he'd reclaimed his old life, but because he'd forgiven the version of himself that could not. After the ceremony, a photographer gathered everyone for a group picture: patients, therapists, volunteers, and Adrian and Lena in the center. The flash popped, capturing a moment that would later hang in the lobby. Two people who had once met in tragedy, now framed by hope. When the room emptied, Adrian stayed behind, staring at the fresh print drying on the table. He noticed something. The reflection of light through the window formed a shape over Lena's hand, right where her scar was. It looked like a faint halo. For the first time, he didn't see pain there. He saw a story that had ended and begun at the same time. Later that night, he sat by the window and began to write. Not to Lena, but to Miguel. "Miguel, we never met beyond that terrible night, but your sister told me what you did. I've carried your name in my silence for too long. You saved a stranger that night, and in doing so, you saved a future you never saw. I thought forgiveness was about absolving others, but it's really about releasing yourself from grief. Rest easy. She's okay now. We both are." He folded the paper, lit a small candle, and let the flame devour the words until they became light. Outside, the rain softened to mist. A month later, Adrian and Lena drove to the coast where the accident had once changed everything. The road was new now, repaved, lined with signs that warned drivers to slow down. Lena sat beside him in the car, hands folded in her lap. Neither spoke for the first hour. Then, as they passed the turn where his life had once ended and begun, he reached for her hand. "I thought I was coming back to make peace with the past," he said softly. "But I think I'm just here to say thank you." She smiled through tears. "For what?" "For staying when you didn't have to." They pulled over by the cliff, the ocean spreading beneath them like eternity. Waves crashed softly against stone. Lena placed a small flower into the wind and let it go. In that simple gesture, they buried what remained of their guilt and kept only what was meant to stay: love. Back in the city, the foundation expanded. New projects, new centers, new lives being rewritten. Lena coordinated translation for global branches. Adrian mentored young entrepreneurs who had suffered loss and refused to quit. Each evening, they sat by the window of their shared office, watching the lights come alive, one by one, across the city they had once viewed from different hearts. He still had bad days. She still had dreams that woke her in the night. But now, they had someone to turn toward instead of away from. That's what healing really is. Not forgetting, but remembering without bleeding. One evening, a summer storm rolled over the city. Thunder murmured in the distance. Lena stood by the window, watching raindrops trace familiar paths down the glass. Adrian wheeled up beside her and said almost to himself, "It's been 2 years today." She looked at him. "Since the accident?" He nodded. "Since the night everything changed." She placed her hand over his. "Then maybe it's time to stop counting from that night and start counting from this one." He looked at her and smiled, not the smile of a billionaire or a survivor, but the quiet peace of a man who'd finally come home to himself. The sun pushed through the storm, casting liquid gold across the room. It touched their faces, their hands, the old scars that had become beautiful in their honesty. The light didn't erase the rain. It simply proved they could exist together. That night, Adrian sat alone in his office and recorded a message for the center's next campaign. But this time, the script was his own. "People ask if I ever wish I could walk again. The truth is, I already have. Not on my feet, but through the hearts that helped me stand when I couldn't. Through the smiles that translated pain into something worth living for. Life doesn't owe us a second chance, but sometimes it gives us a second language, one written in forgiveness, spoken in love." He ended the recording with a smile that reached his eyes. Lena watched from the doorway, hands folded against her heart. For a moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Dawn broke over the city again, light streaming through the same windows that had once reflected loneliness. Now they reflected something else. Two shadows side by side, one seated, one standing, both whole. Lena opened the window. The air was cool and fresh. "Smell that?" she said. "New rain." Adrian closed his eyes, listening to the world outside. The city he had once feared to face, now breathing with him again. In every language, love sounds different, but in its truest form, it sounds like this: two people who refuse to let their past define their future. A self-made millionaire in a wheelchair who found his faith in a translator's smile. And a woman who learned that forgiveness isn't a gift you give others. It's the language that finally sets you free.